The woke movement tried to shame him, but they picked the wrong target. The air inside the community hall was thick with tension. Rows of folding chairs, filled to capacity, faced a small podium at the front of the room, where a young activist was in the middle of an impassioned speech. Gregory Miles, seated near the back, adjusted his weight slightly, his prosthetic leg pressing awkwardly against the metal of his chair. His eyes scanned the room, noting a mix of familiar faces, neighbors, small business owners, and a handful of local officials. For the most part, he kept his head down, uninterested in the evening's heated debates about local issues. But when Maya Sanders, the fiery activist at the microphone, raised her voice to a crescendo, something about her words began to gnaw at him. "Privilege," she said, her voice sharp and certain. "It's everywhere. It's in the decisions made by the people sitting in this room, in the lives they lead, in what they take for granted every single day. And it's time we started holding them accountable." Maya's gaze swept over the audience, her youthful intensity demanding attention. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, her eyes locked on Gregory. She pointed, her finger cutting through the air like a dagger. "Take him, for example," she said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence that followed. A perfect symbol of unchecked privilege. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Gregory blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some leaning in closer to see the confrontation unfolding, others exchanging incredulous glances. Maya, unfazed, continued, "This is what I'm talking about. A man like him has benefited his whole life from systems that favor people like him, systems that ignore the voices of those who are struggling to survive. And yet, here he sits complacent." Her words were sharp and deliberate, each syllable delivered with precision. Gregory felt the heat rise to his face. He froze, unsure how to react. The accusation felt like a sucker punch. Unexpected, baseless, but somehow devastating. His mind raced as he tried to process her words. Did she know about the nights he'd spent on the battlefield, the friends he'd lost, the leg he'd sacrificed for his country? Surely, she couldn't mean him. But the way her gaze stayed fixed on him left no doubt. She was speaking to him, and now everyone else in the room was staring too. "You don't know me," Gregory finally muttered under his breath, though the words felt inadequate. Around him, the whispers grew louder. A woman a few rows ahead shook her head in disapproval, while a man in the corner muttered something about respect. But just as many people nodded along with Maya's words, their faces lit with agreement. "She's right," one voice murmured. Finally, someone sang it out loud. Maya leaned into the microphone, sensing the growing momentum. "You may think you've earned your place in life," she said, her tone tinged with derision. "But that's the lie we've all been told, isn't it? That success is about merit. That some sacrifices mean more than others. Tell me, sir," she gestured toward him again, "what have you sacrificed for the greater good of those less fortunate? Or is your sacrifice only for those who already have more than enough?" Gregory's hands clenched the armrests of his chair. His body felt heavy, not just from the weight of his prosthetic, but from the crushing force of her words. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind snapping from disbelief to determination. If she wanted a confrontation, she'd get one. But not like this. Not with him sitting helplessly in the back row while she dictated the terms. He pushed himself upright, the metal leg joint clicking audibly as he stood. The sound cut through the murmurs in the room like a warning shot, silencing all but the faint shuffling of feet. Gregory's height, coupled with his broad shoulders and military bearing, gave him an imposing presence even as he leaned slightly for balance. The room seemed to hold its breath as Gregory began to speak. His voice was low and steady, each word deliberate. "I'm not sure what you think you know about me," he said, locking eyes with Maya, "but let me tell you something. Privilege isn't what carried me through a war zone. Privilege didn't pull me out of the wreckage when an IED blew up the vehicle I was riding in. And privilege sure as hell didn't give me this." He gestured to his prosthetic leg, the bitterness in his tone unmistakable. Maya faltered for a moment, her mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came. The room remained still, every eye fixed on Gregory as he continued. "You want to talk about sacrifice? His voice cracked slightly, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "I'll tell you about sacrifice. But not tonight, not like this. Because if you want to have this conversation, we're going to do it with respect. And right now, I'm not seeing much of that coming from you." The tension in the room was electric, every second stretched taut with anticipation. Gregory's gaze swept over the audience, meeting the eyes of the few who dared to look at him directly. Finally, he turned back to Maya. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But I'll be happy to enlighten you." With that, he sat back down, the thud of his prosthetic against the floor punctuating his words. The room erupted into murmurs once more, but this time they were different. Less unified, more chaotic. Some people clapped hesitantly, while others looked at Maya expectantly, waiting to see if she'd rise to the challenge. Maya herself seemed caught off guard, her confident demeanor cracking ever so slightly. But she didn't back down, her jaw tightening as she adjusted the microphone. Gregory leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, he had said his piece. And as the whispers in the room began to settle, he couldn't help but wonder what the next round would bring. Gregory Miles's earliest memories were of calloused hands, the smell of motor oil, and the steady hum of machinery. His father worked long hours in the town's only factory, barely scraping enough to provide for the family. Gregory often watched his father stumble through the front door, face streaked with grease, exhaustion etched into every line of his weathered face. "A man earns his keep," his father would say, even as he worked through the pain of a bad back and aching joints. Gregory admired his father's resilience, but deep down, he yearned for something more, a way out of the endless grind that seemed to define his family's existence. When Gregory turned 18, a recruitment officer visited his high school. The man's crisp uniform and polished demeanor made an immediate impression. To Gregory, the military wasn't just an opportunity, it was an escape. Within months, he was in basic training, his body pushed to limits he didn't know existed. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose. "Be the best," his drill sergeant barked, and Gregory took the words to heart, pouring every ounce of himself into becoming not just a soldier, but a leader. It was in his third tour overseas that everything changed. Gregory's unit was on patrol when an IED exploded beneath their convoy. The force of the blast sent him hurtling into a ditch, consciousness fading as pain consumed him. When he woke in a military hospital weeks later, his right leg was gone. Recovery was brutal, not just physically but emotionally. He wrestled with anger, self-pity, and the nagging question, was it worth it? Yet with time, Gregory found his answer. He'd given a piece of himself for the ideals he believed in, and that, he told himself, was enough. Across the city, Maya Sanders grew up in a world that felt like it was constantly closing in. The apartment she shared with her mother and two younger brothers was cramped and stifling, its walls paper-thin. The sounds of sirens and arguments were a constant backdrop to her childhood, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from the television when her mother could spare a moment to sit with them. Maya's father, once a pillar of their family, was absent, not because he wanted to be, but because he'd been taken from them. She was only 8 when her father was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence was flimsy, but it didn't matter. In their neighborhood, the system didn't need much to tear families apart. Maya remembered clutching her mother's hand in the courtroom, her father's voice cracking as he promised to come back to them. He didn't. His absence left a gaping hole in their lives, one that Maya tried desperately to fill. By the time she was in high school, she was devouring books about civil rights leaders, activists, and revolutionaries. Each story fueled a fire in her chest, a determination to fight for justice, no matter the cost. When she entered college on a scholarship, Maya found her voice. Protests, rallies, and organizing efforts became her lifeblood. Her speeches electrified crowds, her words a rallying cry for those who felt voiceless. She carried her father's memory with her always, a reminder of why she fought so hard. To her, the world was divided between those who suffered under oppression and those who enabled it. It was a simple dichotomy, one that left little room for nuance or compromise. Gregory and Maya's lives could not have been more different, yet they were shaped by forces equally unforgiving. Gregory's identity was built on sacrifice, giving of himself for something greater, enduring pain to uphold a sense of duty. Maya, on the other hand, found purpose in resistance, pushing against a world she saw as inherently unjust, fighting to reclaim what had been stolen from her family and countless others. Where Gregory saw the military as a path to honor and self-respect, Maya saw it as an institution complicit in systemic oppression. Where Maya viewed activism as a moral obligation, Gregory saw it as a luxury, one afforded to those who didn't have to worry about surviving day to day. They lived in parallel worlds, their perspectives shaped by experiences the other could scarcely comprehend. As the present crept back into focus, the tension in the town hall became almost palpable. Gregory sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight as he replayed Maya's accusations in his mind. Maya, still standing at the podium, scanned the audience, her expression a mixture of defiance and anticipation. Both knew that the next word spoken could change everything, for them and for the people watching. Gregory Miles stood again, his prosthetic leg making its presence known with a muted clank against the floor. He straightened his shoulders, his face calm, but his eyes fierce. The murmurs in the room fell to a hush, the weight of his presence commanding attention. He gripped the back of his chair briefly, grounding himself before he spoke. "You called me a symbol of unchecked privilege," he began, his voice measured but firm. "Let me tell you what that privilege looks like." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It looks like being 19 years old, crouched in a ditch, praying that the mortar fire raining down on you misses by just a few feet. It looks like holding your best friend's hand while he bleeds out on foreign soil because you can't stop the shrapnel in his chest. It looks like waking up in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, and realizing you'll never run again because part of your leg is gone." The room was silent. Gregory's voice grew rougher, the emotions behind his words threatening to break through. "I didn't serve because I was looking for a handout. I served because I believed in protecting the people I cared about. I believed in standing up for something bigger than myself. And yes, I paid a price for that belief, a price I carry with me every day. So, if you're going to point at me and call me privileged, you'd better damn well understand what you're talking about." Before Gregory could continue, Maya raised a hand, her expression resolute. "I don't doubt your sacrifices," she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But those sacrifices were made in the service of a system that perpetuates inequality. You fought in wars that were about power, profit, and control, not about protecting people like me or the communities I come from." The crowd stirred, divided between murmurs of agreement and disapproving shakes of heads. Maya stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. "You say you've suffered, and I believe you. But what about the suffering caused by the decisions your commanders made? What about the innocent lives lost in those wars? What about the resources that could have gone to education, healthcare, or housing but were spent on military budgets instead?" Gregory's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Do you think we had the luxury of making those decisions on the battlefield?" He shot back, his tone sharper now. "Do you think we stopped to ask who signed the checks while we were evacuating civilians under fire? I've seen what happens when the people you're trying to save are caught in the crossfire. I've held children in my arms who didn't make it, and every single one of us, every soldier out there, carries the weight of those moments with us." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Gregory's voice softened, but didn't lose its intensity. "You think we're complicit? Fine, but let me tell you what else we are. We're the ones who ran into burning buildings when no one else would. We're the ones who stayed behind to shield people while bombs fell. We're the ones who made choices no one should ever have to make because someone had to do it. And maybe, just maybe, you should think about that before you condemn us." A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant but growing in strength. Maya, her lips pressed into a thin line, refused to back down. "You talk about choices," she said, her voice rising to match his. "What about the choices people in my community never had? What about the systems that pushed them into poverty, into prisons, into graves. Those systems don't just exist on their own. They're upheld by people who choose to ignore the damage they cause. People like you? Gregory's hand curled into a fist, but he unclenched it with a visible effort. You think I ignore the damage? I live with it every single day. Every scar, every nightmare, every person I couldn't save. It's all right here, he said, placing a hand on his chest. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. I don't need a lecture about oppression. I've seen it. I've fought against it. And if you think for 1 second that I don't care, then you don't know a damn thing about me. The audience was visibly divided. On one side, a group of older attendees nodded fervently, some clapping in solidarity. On the other, younger voices muttered in support of Maya, their expressions resolute. The energy in the room crackled like a live wire. Every word exchanged between Gregory and Maya fanning the flames of the crowd's emotions. One woman stood and shouted, "Thank you for your service, Gregory." Her voice was quickly drowned out by another, younger man who yelled back, "She's right, he's part of the problem." The debate between Gregory and Maya had spilled into the crowd, fracturing it into opposing camps. Gregory's chest heaved as he took a deep breath. "I didn't come here to argue," he said, though his voice carried the weight of the confrontation. "I came here because I care about this community, because I care about the people in this room. And if you want to talk about fixing problems, fine. But don't stand there and tell me I'm the problem without knowing my story." Maya opened her mouth to respond, but something in Gregory's tone gave her pause. For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, the fire in her eyes dimming. Yet, she held her ground, her fingers gripping the podium, like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "I hear your pain," she said, her voice quieter now. "But pain isn't an excuse to ignore the bigger picture. We all have to take responsibility for the roles we play, whether we mean to or not." Gregory stared at her for a long moment, the lines on his face deepening as he processed her words. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, his voice heavy with fatigue. "But responsibility cuts both ways. You've got no right to stand there and judge me without understanding what I've been through, or what I've done to try and make things better." The room was still, the energy that had surged moments before now hanging suspended in the air. Gregory's voice dropped to a near whisper as he concluded, "We're all trying to make sense of a broken world. But pointing fingers won't fix it. If you really want change, maybe start by listening to the people you're so quick to condemn." Maya didn't respond. She couldn't. Gregory's words hung in the silence between them, heavy and unyielding. The audience seemed equally stunned, the once divided factions now united in their collective anticipation of what would happen next. Gregory sat down slowly, his prosthetic leg thudding softly against the floor. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his body visibly drained. Maya remained at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she clung to her principles, even as doubt flickered in her eyes. The confrontation had ended, but the battle lines were far from erased. As the moderator awkwardly attempted to regain control of the meeting, Gregory and Maya exchanged one final look, a silent acknowledgement that, while their fight had ended for now, their story was far from over. The fallout began within hours. Clips from the town hall flooded social media, shared with captions designed to inflame. Veteran School's woke activist read one viral post, racking up millions of views. Another, more damning edit, labeled "Veteran Denies Privilege," portrayed Gregory as dismissive and unrepentant. The digital battlefield was set, with Gregory Miles unwittingly thrust into the center of a firestorm. On platforms like Twitter and TikTok, hashtags like #GregoryMiles and #PrivilegeDebate trended relentlessly. Gregory's stoic expression and Maya's impassioned accusations were dissected in comments, memes, and reaction videos. Supporters hailed him as a voice of reason, while critics lambasted him as an emblem of outdated thinking. His inbox filled with messages ranging from heartfelt thanks to vicious vitriol. Meanwhile, Gregory, unfamiliar with the viral maelstrom, watched in quiet bewilderment as his name became a lightning rod for cultural divisions. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered to himself, scrolling through a barrage of notifications on his old phone. Yet, The magnitude of the moment wasn't lost on him. Somehow, a town hall speech had morphed into a national conversation, and Gregory was caught in the eye of the storm. Maya Sanders wasn't spared either. Among her peers in the activist community, she was hailed as a bold voice willing to challenge the status quo, even when it meant going toe-to-toe with a veteran. Her followers swelled by the thousands. Her social media flooded with messages of solidarity. But the backlash was equally fierce. Critics accused her of crossing a line by targeting a disabled veteran, calling her attacks cruel and tone-deaf. "This isn't activism, it's bullying," one prominent commentator posted, sparking heated debates in her mentions. Maya read every comment, her jaw tightening with each insult. Her mentor, a seasoned activist named Evelyn Grant, invited her for coffee the next day. "You've stirred the pot, Maya," Evelyn said, her tone a mix of pride and caution. "That's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a fine line between provoking thought and alienating people. Be careful." Maya bristled, her resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down," she replied. "If we can't challenge symbols of systemic privilege, what's the point?" Evelyn sighed, but didn't push further. While the online world erupted, Gregory's personal life took an unexpected turn. Late one evening, his phone buzzed with a call from a number he hadn't seen in years. Hesitating, he answered, his voice guarded. "Hello, Dad, it's me. Rachel." Gregory's heart skipped a beat. His estranged daughter's voice was unmistakable, though tinged with an unfamiliar sharpness. "Rachel," he said softly, "I didn't expect to hear from you." Rachel didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I saw the video, Dad. Everyone's talking about it." She paused, her tone shifting to something more pointed. "You have a platform now. Don't waste it defending yourself. Use it to actually make a difference." Gregory frowned, caught off guard. "You think I'm not making a difference by standing up for what I believe in?" he asked. Rachel sighed. "I think you're letting this spiral into a fight about you when it could be about something bigger. People are listening, really listening. What do you want them to hear?" Her words struck a nerve, stirring something Gregory couldn't quite name. After she hung up, he sat in the quiet of his small living room, her question echoing in his mind. What did he want people to hear? The next morning, Gregory stared at his laptop, a secondhand machine he barely knew how to operate. The notifications from social media overwhelmed him, but Rachel's words lingered. For the first time, he considered responding, not with anger or defensiveness, but with purpose. Meanwhile, Maya scrolled through her phone, reading both praise and criticism. A particularly scathing comment caught her attention. "Attacking a veteran doesn't make you brave. It makes you heartless." Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, doubts creeping into the corners of her mind. Both Gregory and Maya faced their crossroads, though neither realized how intertwined their journeys were becoming. The town hall was no longer just an event. It was a spark, igniting conversations neither of them could control. The backlash was relentless, and Maya felt its weight pressing down on her. Support from her activist community was abundant at first. Messages lauding her courage and tenacity poured in. But the tide began to shift. In private groups, whispers of dissent grew louder. Some criticized her approach, calling it a misstep that alienated potential allies. Attacking a disabled veteran? What kind of optics is that? One prominent figure posted in a forum. Maya scanned the threads, her stomach sinking as more voices chimed in. "It's one thing to challenge privilege," another wrote, "but we have to be strategic. This just looks like punching down." The words stung more than she expected. They weren't from trolls or strangers, but people she considered her allies, her friends. The solidarity she had leaned on for strength was now fractured, and she was beginning to feel isolated. She tried to brush it off, but the doubts lingered. For the first time since the town hall, she allowed herself to wonder if she had gone too far. Seeking guidance, Maya reached out to Evelyn Grant. Over tea in Evelyn's small, book-lined apartment, Maya voiced her frustration. "Why are people turning on me?" she asked, her voice taut with frustration. "I was standing up for what we believe in." Evelyn leaned back, her expression calm but probing. "Were you, though?" she asked gently. "Or were you reacting out of anger?" Maya bristled. "I was making a point. Gregory Miles represents everything wrong with this system. He's the poster child for unearned respect and privilege. Evelyn shook her head. He's also a human being, Maya. A complicated one, like the rest of us. You've got the fire, but sometimes fire destroys more than it illuminates. The words landed like a blow. Evelyn wasn't scolding her, but offering a challenge, a mirror to her own doubts. Do you feel like you're creating the change you set out to? Evelyn asked, her voice softer now. Or are you just fighting for the sake of fighting? Maya didn't answer, her thoughts spiraling into unfamiliar territory. Haunted by Evelyn's words and the backlash online, Maya found herself drawn to a place she hadn't visited in years, her childhood home. The once vibrant neighborhood was now a shadow of itself. Many storefronts shuttered and homes falling into disrepair. She parked in front of the small, weathered house she grew up in, memories rushing back like an unrelenting tide. Inside, the old wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture was covered in dust, untouched since her father's imprisonment. She ran her fingers along the edge of the dining table, remembering the evenings spent here with him before everything changed. The image of her father, strong, proud, and unjustly taken away, filled her with a familiar anger. She sat down in the living room, staring at a framed photo of her family from happier times. They didn't break him, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But they sure as hell broke us. Her father's wrongful imprisonment had shaped everything. Her anger, her activism, her unyielding sense of justice. But now, for the first time, she questioned the path she had chosen. Was she fighting for him, or had her cause become something else entirely? The visit stirred a maelstrom of emotions within Maya. She drove back to her apartment in silence, the weight of her reflection almost unbearable. That night, she opened her journal, a practice she had long abandoned. She wrote furiously, spilling out her fears, doubts, and anger onto the pages. She thought about Gregory in the town hall, his calm defiance, the way his voice cracked with emotion. It was hard to reconcile that man with the symbol she had painted him as. Was she wrong about him? Or had she been too quick to reduce him to an idea, forgetting the person underneath? By the time she closed the journal, her mind was no clearer. But one thing had shifted. Her certainty was gone. In its place was a question. What kind of change did she really want to create? Determined to move forward, Maya reached out to her activist circle, determined to reassert herself. But the confidence she once carried felt fractured. In conversations and meetings, she found herself hesitating, second-guessing her words. Her peers noticed the change. Some offered support, while others began to pull away. Maya, are you okay? One friend asked after a meeting. You don't seem like yourself lately. I'm fine, Maya replied, forcing a smile. But she wasn't fine. The battle that had raged so publicly in the town hall was now waging inside her, and she was no longer sure who was winning. Maya resolved to double down, to find her footing again. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized something she wasn't ready to admit to anyone, not even herself. She no longer knew what that looked like. The small meeting room in the Veteran Center smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. Gregory sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, surrounded by men and women whose faces carried stories as heavy as his own. The group leader, a soft-spoken Marine named Tom, opened the session with a simple question. What's been on your mind this week? When it was Gregory's turn, he hesitated. The weight of the town hall debacle and its viral aftermath was still raw. I ended up in some kind of public circus, he finally said. Got called a symbol of privilege by a young activist in front of an entire room. And now half the internet. A ripple of murmured reactions passed through the group, some empathetic, others skeptical. Gregory leaned forward, his prosthetic leg pressing against the chair. I'm not some saint, but I gave a lot for this country. Hearing someone question that, it's hard to take. His voice faltered, and for a moment, the group was silent. Then Tom spoke. Sounds like it hit a nerve. But have you thought about why she said it? The group discussion was challenging, but unexpectedly insightful. A younger veteran named Malik chimed in, his tone pointed but not unkind. Man, I get it. We sacrificed a lot. But if you only focus on your sacrifice, you're missing the bigger picture. People like her? They're not coming at you personally. They're coming at the system. Another voice joined in. You don't have to agree with her tactics, but maybe there's something worth listening to. Gregory crossed his arms, instinctively defensive. And what? Just let her attack me without pushing back. Tom shook his head. No one's saying that. But you've got a platform now, whether you want it or not. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Just defend yourself? Or try to understand where she's coming from and build a bridge? The question lingered with Gregory long after the meeting ended. That evening, as he nursed a lukewarm beer in his living room, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Rachel standing there, a hesitant smile on her face. "Rachel," he said, surprised. "Come in." She stepped inside, her movements awkward but determined. After a moment of small talk, she cut to the chase. "I've been thinking about what I said on the phone," she began, "about using your platform. But I also need to talk about us." Gregory's chest tightened. "Us?" Rachel nodded, her eyes steady. "Dad, you've always been so focused on your service and what it meant to you. But you've never really asked what it meant for me. When you came back, you weren't really there." Her words were like a punch to the gut, but Gregory forced himself to listen. Rachel continued, her voice breaking. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I know you went through hell, but so did I in my own way. And if you want to make something good out of this mess with Maya, you need to start seeing the world through someone else's eyes, like you've never seen through mine." The conversation with Rachel stirred something deep within Gregory. That night, he found himself poring over articles and videos about activism and privilege, terms that had once felt like buzzwords now carried weight. He didn't agree with everything he saw, but he couldn't deny there were truths he'd been blind to. As the hours stretched on, he felt an urge he hadn't experienced in years, the need to put his thoughts into words. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking on a blank document, and began to type. The op-ed came together in fits and starts. Gregory wrote about his childhood, the blue-collar struggles that shaped him, and his decision to enlist. He described the horrors of war and the friends he had lost, the agony of coming home to a country that seemed indifferent to his sacrifices. But he also wrote about the town hall, about the moment Maya's words had cut through his defenses. For the first time, he wrote, "I realized that my pain and pride don't exist in a vacuum. They are part of a larger story, a story I need to understand, not just defend." The next morning, Gregory sent the piece to a major newspaper, unsure if it would even be read. But the act of writing it felt like a step forward, a way to shift the conversation from anger to understanding. As he hit send, a sense of resolve settled over him. He wasn't letting go of his principles, but he was learning to hold them alongside something new, empathy for a world he hadn't fully seen before. Meanwhile, Rachel texted him later that day, "Proud of you, Dad." It was a small message, but it meant the world to Gregory. In the days that followed, he waited anxiously for a response from the newspaper. But more than that, he found himself thinking not about what he had said, but about what he still needed to hear. And somewhere in the city, Maya was beginning to wrestle with those very same questions. The bright lights of the studio felt oppressive, casting long shadows on the polished stage. Gregory adjusted his blazer nervously, the weight of his prosthetic leg making him feel unbalanced in more ways than one. Across the stage, Maya sat poised, her every movement deliberate, as if rehearsed 100 times over. The debate's moderator, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for stirring the pot, welcomed the live audience and the millions watching from home. "This evening," the moderator began, "we bring together two voices at the center of a national conversation. Gregory Miles, a decorated veteran, and Maya Sanders, a leading activist. Both have ignited passionate reactions, both inspiring and divisive. Tonight, they'll engage in a dialogue about privilege, sacrifice, and justice." Gregory swallowed hard as the camera turned to him. He had faced enemy fire, but this felt like a battlefield of an entirely different kind. Maya launched into her opening remarks with the precision of an orator. "We live in a world built on systems that perpetuate inequality," she declared. "For too long, those who benefit from these systems have turned a blind eye to the suffering of others." Her words were sharp and unyielding, a rallying cry for her supporters. Gregory waited for her to finish before leaning forward into the microphone. "I don't disagree that we need to address inequality," he said, his voice measured but firm. "But labeling me, someone who's given everything, including a part of my body, as a symbol of privilege is not the way to do it." The room seemed to hold its breath. Gregory continued, sharing the struggles of his youth, the decision to enlist, and the unimaginable horrors he'd endured. "I've seen lives destroyed on battlefields and here at home. If that's privilege, I'd love for someone to explain it to me." The exchange grew increasingly heated. Maya pressed on, arguing that Gregory's sacrifices didn't absolve him from participating in larger systems of power. "Your service is honorable, Mr. Miles," she said, "but it exists within a framework that marginalizes millions." Gregory's jaw tightened. "And what framework do you think allowed me to save a life that day?" Maya blinked, caught off guard by the shift in his tone. Gregory's voice softened as he recounted a story he had never shared publicly. "It was during my last deployment. We were ambushed. I saw one of my men, barely more than a kid, trapped under fire. I ran to him, carried him out, even as I was hit. That's how I lost my leg." The audience leaned forward collectively, hanging on his every word. Gregory paused before delivering the bombshell. That soldier wasn't just anyone. He was someone who believed in fighting for justice. Someone who had been organizing protests and advocating for change long before he put on a uniform. His name was Elliot Banks. The mention of Elliot, a revered figure in Maya's movement, landed like a thunderclap. Maya's composure wavered as the audience erupted into applause. Unable to shake the weight of Gregory's revelation, Maya spent the next day combing through records of Elliot Banks. She unearthed articles and interviews documenting his activism, his decision to enlist, and his miraculous rescue. Every piece of evidence pointed to the truth. Gregory Miles had saved the life of one of her heroes. Staring at her laptop screen, Maya felt a mix of awe and unease. Could two people who seemed so diametrically opposed have more in common than she was willing to admit? Determined to get clarity, Maya reached out to Elliot. To her surprise, he agreed to meet. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Elliot spoke with reverence about Gregory. "That man," he said, shaking his head with a soft smile, "risked everything for me. And it wasn't because he agreed with me or even knew who I was. It was because he saw another human being in need. That's what I try to do in my work now, to honor the life he gave back to me." Maya listened intently as Elliot shared his philosophy. Activism and service aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. We all want a better world. We're just coming at it from different angles. Moved by Elliot's words, Maya realized she couldn't continue the battle without acknowledging the truth. She drafted a message to Gregory, asking for a private meeting. When they sat down in a small, neutral venue, the air between them was charged with tension. "Why did you save him?" Maya asked bluntly, her voice trembling. Gregory looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because it's what you do." It wasn't about politics or ideologies. It was about saving someone's son, someone's friend. That's what mattered in that moment. The conversation that followed was honest and raw. They challenged each other, but for the first time they also listened. By the end, they reached a tentative understanding. While their methods and perspectives differed, their goals of justice and humanity weren't so far apart after all. As they parted ways, Gregory and Maya both felt a cautious hope, a sense that this confrontation, born of division, might yet plant the seeds for something greater. Gregory stared at the glowing cursor on his laptop, the blank document mocking him. Across town, Maya had the same hesitation. Despite their differences, they had agreed to co-author an article reflecting on the lessons learned from their fiery confrontation. If we can show others how dialogue can bridge divides, maybe this can mean something, Gregory had said during their last meeting. Now, as the first words took shape, both felt the weight of the task ahead. Titled From Conflict to Connection, Lessons from a Veteran and an Activist, the article began by recounting their clash at the town hall and the revelations that followed. Gregory wrote about sacrifice and the human cost of service, while Maya reflected on privilege and systemic oppression. They both emphasized the importance of listening without the intent to destroy the other side. When it was finally published, the article ignited passionate reactions. Some hailed it as a beacon of hope, while others dismissed it as performative. Their collaboration didn't end with the article. Invited to a community forum, they hesitated but ultimately agreed to appear together. The packed room buzzed with anticipation, the energy teetering between curiosity and hostility. "This is no different from facing the front lines," Gregory muttered to Maya as they took their seats. She smirked nervously. "Except no one's shooting. At least not yet." The forum began with tough questions. A man accused Gregory of enabling oppression through his military service, while another challenged Maya on her approach to activism. Both responded with candor and restraint, offering glimpses of their evolving perspectives. Gregory spoke about the complexities of his choices, while Maya admitted the limitations of her prior tactics. Despite the heated moments, there were unexpected breakthroughs. An older woman shared how her veteran husband had also struggled with feeling misunderstood, while a young activist described her own disillusionment with divisive tactics. For the first time, Gregory and Maya weren't just debating, they were facilitating a conversation. By the evening's end, they sat in silence, watching as attendees lingered to talk among themselves. "We did something good tonight," Maya said softly. Gregory nodded. "It's a start," he replied, the words carrying both hope and caution. They knew this was only the beginning. Their collaboration would continue to draw fire from all sides, but for the first time, both felt they were working towards something bigger than themselves. Months after their explosive debate, Gregory stood at the edge of a park, watching a group of kids play. Rachel had urged him to take a step back from the chaos and focus on healing. "You can't help others if you're still carrying the weight of your own anger," she'd said. Their relationship had grown stronger in the aftermath, with Rachel joining Gregory in some of his advocacy work. Reflecting on his journey, Gregory realized how the confrontation with Maya had transformed him. Instead of seeing her as an adversary, he now saw her as someone who pushed him to grow. Through their partnership, he found a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a veteran, but as a bridge builder. Across town, Maya stood before a packed university auditorium, her heart pounding. This was the first time she would openly discuss her regrets and lessons learned. "I believed activism was about shouting the loudest," she began, "but I've learned that change comes from listening and building, even when it's uncomfortable." Her speech wove together stories of her father's resilience, her clashes with Gregory, and the unexpected insights that had shaped her journey. "It's not about abandoning our fight for justice," she concluded, "but about recognizing the humanity in those we're fighting against." The applause was thunderous, but Maya left the stage with a quiet sense of humility. The story's final chapter unfolded at a town hall. This time, one Gregory and Maya had organized together. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, sharing stories of reconciliation and understanding. A middle-aged man spoke about mending a fractured friendship, while a young woman described bridging generational divides in her family. Sitting side by side, Gregory and Maya exchanged a glance. Their journey hadn't erased their differences, but it had shown them the power of empathy and collaboration. As the town hall ended, Gregory rose to shake hands with attendees, while Maya stayed to speak with a group of students. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about starting a conversation that might, one day, lead to a better world. As they left the building, the warm glow of streetlights casting long shadows behind them, the seeds of hope they'd planted began to take root.